Hello, hello, hello. We are back and live. And tonight right now we have Kaylee Zheng all the way from Hartford, Connecticut, who single-handedly installs Pratt & Whitney engines on Airbuses and who is the Nutmeg Division Superintendent. She is here to present our clinic on using cell phone speakers for DCC. Kelly, take it away.
Hello, everybody. How's everyone doing today? Hopefully, you are all staying safe and doing well. Tonight, we'll have a very special presentation for you guys with using cellular loudspeakers for DCC sound. Before we start, I want to give a big shout out to Jordan. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I also want to give a shout out to Gordy and the rest of the NMRAx team for putting this together and organizing this. This is, I think, a great new frontier that we're going to be experimenting with, and hopefully we'll be bringing more interesting programming in the near future. So, with that being said, let's get started. A little bit about me first, for those who don't know me. As Jordan alluded to, I am a mechanical engineer who work in the aviation industry. I'm currently an engineering contractor for Pratt & Whitney, which is a major aircraft engine manufacturer here in Connecticut. Originally, I was from Phillipsburg, New Jersey, and my love of trains all started from there. For those who know Northeastern railroading, Phillipsburg, New Jersey was a very important junction, as it was the first town in New Jersey right across the Delaware River. So many railroads coming over from the Bethlehem, Allentown, and Easton area all crossed into Phillipsburg. Some of you may have seen me on a 2006 documentary film called Model Citizens, or you may have heard my voice, as I'm a frequent contributor to both A Modeler's Life and Model Rail Radio podcasts. I currently do model in HO scale. I am in the process of working on the layout. And as Jordan had mentioned before, I am the current superintendent of the Nutmeg Division, as well as the photo contest chair for the Northeastern region. So for those who are coming in, we are still having our regional conference in October. More information, you can go to www.millcity2020.com. And if you do come, please, 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 I would love to see your photographs, and I would love to have it in the photo contest. So there's a plug for our Northeastern convention, and right now we're still go for this convention in October. All right, so let's get started. So tonight we're going to talk about DCC sound, a little bit about what it is, why it's so great. We're going to talk about mobile loudspeakers, it's cell phone speakers, what makes them work, why they sound better, etc. I'll go through a little bit of an installation tips and tricks, and then we'll conclude the program with a live demo. For those who want a copy of this presentation, you can go to the A Modeler's Life podcast page, www.amodelerslife.com/clinics.html, and scroll down, and you can find a copy of this presentation. For this program, I'm going to do something a little bit unusual. I'm going to ask everyone to hold off on asking questions till the very end, or when we get to the question slides, so we can have time to set up the live demo portion. So with that, let's get started. Okay, DCC sound. Why is it so great? Well, DCC sound brings a whole new level of realism to operations. And what do I mean by that is we have things like bridges, tunnels, stations, grade crossings. They're all now interactive points on the layout. Also, things like communicating with crews, between train crews, conductor, engineer, etc. That's now another interactive point on the layout. And then as a side benefit, you can use the sound to kind of track if a train is moving inside of a hidden piece of hidden trackage. There's nothing more frustrating than seeing your train enter into a helix, and then suddenly you wait and wait and wait, and nothing comes out at the other end of the tunnel. So side benefit with that, you could track it and then send in a rescue crew as necessary. So in summary, DCC sound gives life to an otherwise flat world. But like all good things in life, there are challenges associated with DCC sound. Well, for one, you have large, cumbersome components that you have to mount. And for what do I mean by that? Well, here's a picture of a standard DCC sound decoder. You have the decoder itself that has to be mounted. You have wire bundles that needs to be accounted for and tucked into the shell. Obviously, you have a speaker you have to worry about. And then most DCC sound also includes this external capacitor, so your sound isn't clipped over every little dirty piece of track. You also have to make modifications to the chassis for this hardware. In modern locomotives, where everything we pack the shells now to the hilt with weight to give more pulling power, better traction, you do have to make modifications to accommodate some of all this hardware. You also have to make provisions for sound to emit. Now, not so much of a problem with newer locomotives, as we now have see-through grills. We have different openings throughout the locomotive that will permit the sound to come out. But on older blue box locomotives, Mantuas, AHM, etc., where everything's so tight and tighter than a nun's habit, I would say, you do have to make room for sound to come out. Also, too, sound doesn't sound quite right. And what do I mean by that? Well, we have distortions we also have to worry about. We also lack any sort of depth in that sound, so they just sound kind of flat. There are sounds that originate from odd locations, so nothing more distracting than see this beautiful big boy come out of the tunnel and then hear the chuff coming out of the tender. Okay. So, what is sound? Well, sound at its fundamental is nothing more than a vibration in a fluid. Air in engineering and in science is considered fluid. So, how do you make vibrations in the air? Well, talking does that, but we use what's known as a driver in engineering, or commonly we call it the speaker. Now, the speaker is comprised of several different parts. We have the basket, which is kind of like the backbone of the speaker, which kind of, or driver, will and gives it some structural integrity. You also have the magnet and the voice coil. The magnet, pretty self-explanatory. You have your north and south poles, but you have the voice coil, which is what the wires, when you connect or solder to your decoder, it feeds into this voice coil. And as you put a current through it, it creates its own magnetic field, and it interplays with the magnet, which causes this cone, which is this U-shaped contact lens shape device. And it could be paper, it could be plastic, but that cone is designed to push air up and down, back and forth, due to the interaction of this voice coil. Now, there are a couple of other parts, like the surround, which basically just attaches the cone to the basket, and then a spider, which kind of helps damp out any extra motion so that the speaker doesn't keep bouncing around indefinitely. Okay. So, time and time again, we are told that bigger is always better, right? Well, that's not always true. And yes, that's what she said. Bigger speakers do give the best volume and best amount of bass. However, like Rumpelstiltskin said, there are trade-offs. All magic comes with a price. You lose out on higher frequencies. Why is that? Well, big speakers have a bigger cone, right? Well, bigger cones have more mass, and Newton's first law says that when things are at rest, right, when they're big, fat, dumb, and happy, they don't really want to move. So you can't move it as fast, and doesn't get up to speed very fast. But also, the bigger the mass is, the harder it is to move faster, because that's all higher frequencies. It just means that there's more oscillations or more vibrations in a given second. So big mass, harder to produce higher frequencies. You also have vibrations and resonance problem, because sound is really an energy, right? So inside the locomotive shell, if you don't have things properly secured, it'll start to rattle, and then you'll have different weird noises that's coming out other than the sound that you want to hear. It also requires a big enclosures, and since our locomotives are already packed to the hill with weight, which means you need to have more real estate in order to house the bigger speaker. And then there's also no real need for a loud volume. Now, I put an asterisk there because obviously, if you're going to be in a club setting or in a public setting, say at a train show, then you might want to have the bigger speakers for the more volume. But overall, for our home layouts, generally speaking, we don't really need to have super high volumes for every locomotive. Okay. Speakers, remember how I said they don't really like to move? Well, that's a phenomenon known as dB roll-off. Because it's a mechanical device, it has mechanical limitations. As the graph kind of shows, this is the frequency, the whole human audio spectrum from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. And as you can see at the high end, you see that little tail off. Let me, oops. Go back here for a second. Sorry, folks, minor technical difficulties. Let's see. I presented you. Okay, let me go back a second. Where's my laser pointer? Okay, my laser pointer is not working. Let's not fool around with that. Okay. So I don't know if you can see my cursor, but over at the high end, you see that roll off. That's basically where the speaker can no longer start to produce volume at that certain frequency, because again, physics dictate it can't go that fast. But the problem also exists in this bottom end, where you see towards the low end frequency, it also rolls off. Same thing. A very big speaker can produce it, but it's going to be hard because again, it's fat, dumb, and happy, so it doesn't really want to move. Model railroad speakers tend to start to roll off on the bottom end at around 300 to 500 hertz, which is up in this kind of range. Why is that significant? Hold on to that fact, and I'll tell you in a little bit. Okay, so how do we make things better? Well, we use what's known as an enclosure, or for those across the pond, baffles. The idea of a baffle is to make speakers to be more efficient by eliminating some of that backwards wave coming off from the backstroke of the driver. What do I mean by that? Well, if you look at this animation, you kind of can see it snap forward and snap backwards. When it snaps forward, it produces a wave. Well, usually 9 times out of 10, the speaker or the driver, the basket is actually open. So as it swings forward, it's also swinging backwards. And when it swings backwards, it's actually creating a secondary wave on the back end. Well, when that secondary wave runs around to the front side and merges with the front facing forward direction of the speakers, certain frequencies tend to cancel out or become amplified. So that's why a lot of times most railroad speakers sound flat, because it's missing out or it's being canceled from some of that secondary wave. The enclosures will help with it. However, for best acoustic results, it has to be tuned. Too small, it's not really effective for the lower frequencies. In other words, it can't contain all that energy. Too large, and you can accidentally start highlighting harmonics, which again goes back to the whole issue of having certain frequencies be amplified, and usually the least desirable frequencies, usually in the mid-range. So the $1 million question: what makes for a good enclosure? Well, you have that equation. Then there's this equation. There's that. Ah! Math. Lots and lots of math. That's the recipe for a good enclosure. So modern railroad enclosures, as a result, tends to be too small. One, we have the real estate issues. Two, the challenges of engineering. As you saw, there's a lot of equations and lots of math that's involved with it. And quite frankly, no one has the time with it. I'd rather be painting and weathering locomotives, much like what Ralph has taught, rather than sit there and crunching numbers and doing equations all day long. So it just takes too much time and effort. So as a result of that, we often use the enclosure as kind of an afterthought. We just find space and kind of shoehorn something into it. So as a result of all of that, sound quality, we tend to sacrifice it just for the sake of having sound. Okay, so let's put away our model railroading applications for a second, and then let's talk about the cell phone speakers. Let's talk about our cell phones. Really, any mobile device. It could be our tablets, it could be our laptops, what have you. Our mobile devices have truly become multifunctional devices. And what does that mean? Well, think about it. We use our phones not just to make phone calls, but we also use it as a calendar, a planner, notifications, our entertainment center. I'm sure some of you are watching this over your tablet or using over your cell phones. So your audio has to be able to produce it. We also use it as a camera and video recorder. So we record memories, record photos, record videos. The loudspeakers, when you really think about it, have changed how we use our devices, and how we interact with them. I remember the early days of the Nextel had the push to talk to phones, and it was kind of embarrassing to hear the grocery aisle, the evening plans of the guy of the next aisle over. Okay, so let's pretend we're all engineers for working for a high-tech electronics company. Apple, Samsung, LG, they hired us and they put us in charge with the speaker division. As an engineer, we have to come up with design requirements that's necessary to how we design our end product. What are some of the design requirements for a cell phone? Well, you got to have high clarity and low distortion, right? Because you want to hear what your music, you want to hear what the person has to talk about. You want to hear what was recorded, your own voice notes, etc. Got to be loud enough, right? Because if you don't have it loud enough, you're putting it next to your ear. It kind of defeats the whole purpose of having somebody on speaker. Got to cover the audio, the human audio frequency spectrum. No one wants to sound like Charlie Brown's teacher, so we got to have a nice clear range in the whole human hearing spectrum. And it's still got to be small and compact to fit inside the cell phone, because unfortunately, speakers on cell phones aren't not the first priority. Usually it's power, so the battery kind of dictates how much space is remaining for the speaker. Well, gee, doesn't all that sound familiar? They're perfect for DCC sound. The requirements for our locomotives in DCC is very similar to the requirements that cell phone manufacturers have to face when it comes to their design for their product line. The small size of the cell phone speakers allows for installation in tight locomotive quarters. And the best part is that enclosure is now part of the packaging, and it's engineered for the best performance. So at the end of the day, for our purposes, it's virtually plug and play. Now, Rapido has pioneered the use of cell phone speakers in factory assembled models. So whenever you buy a Rapido product, you're already getting a cell phone speaker installed into your locomotive. That's why they sound so great. The other benefit is that loudspeakers are optimized for human speech frequencies. For men, it tends to resonate around 85 to 180 hertz. For women, it's around 165 to 55 hertz. Now, interesting fun fact, a little trivia fact: high frequencies is usually the first hearing loss to start. It's the first frequency where people experience frequency loss, and that's why a lot of times men have a hard time hearing women because our voice is high up in the frequency range, which means you probably are not even listening to my presentation, so you've missed all of this good stuff. Coincidentally, why is that important for us? Well, diesel locomotives, they tend to fall in that same range. Take a look at this chart. In this particular graph, this was an engine that has a 16 cylinder, a 2,700 horsepower engine, which is pretty typical for most locomotives nowadays, or at least switcher based locomotives. It runs a little hotter than typical diesel locomotives, around 1,800, versus diesel locomotives is around 1,000. But for intensive purposes, this kind of illustrates what I want to demonstrate. If you look at these curves, each color represents how much the engine is loaded. They all tend to have a peak at around 125 hertz. Remember how I said in the very beginning that most model railroad speakers tend to roll off at 300 to 500 hertz? Well, with that little bit of information and taking a look at this graph, all this bottom end, all this bass is missing in our locomotives. The speaker can't physically produce it, so we actually don't get to hear it. So that's why the locomotives tend to sound flat, because as you can see here, it's all in that flat range, and it's all that mid range and high range, so you miss out on that bass. Okay, so here are some examples of cell phone speakers. The iPhone 4 is probably the most ubiquitous of all of them. This is really what started the whole cell phone speaker use in DCC. You kind of could see the dimensions here. It's roughly 2 inches long by 0.6 inches wide and a little over 3/16 tall. The nice thing about the iPhone 4 is that you can actually cut it in half. This is all plastic. You just cut it in half and then seal at the back end. Overall, I would say you can cut up to half of its overall length, and you won't really notice a decrease in performance. Over the size of it too, especially the length, it's really good for large locomotives. You can easily put it in. But why I want to draw your attention to this graph. This is the performance curve, frequency response curve for the iPhone 4 speaker. If you notice, the dB roll off for this particular speaker, the yellow is the iPhone 4, is it around like 175, 150 hertz before it starts to really appreciably roll off into nothingness? That, thinking back on our diesel curve, it shows that a lot of the bass is actually being captured in this particular region. And so that's what gives it the fullness, the depth. It covers a wide range, almost a true 20 to 20 kilohertz range. Okay. So the iPhone 4 is kind of old technology. There's iPhone 5 loudspeaker, which is what's unique about this. This is actually shorter, stubbier, but it is a little wider. Now, you do have to cut off this appendage. Let me do pointer options, laser pointers. Yes, you do have to cut off this little appendage on both models. Starting with the iPhones, their iPhone 5s, they started going to multiple variants of the same family. But overall, the speaker is pretty much the same. In any case, in either iPhone 5S or even regular iPhone 5s, you do have to cut off this appendage and just seal it. Now, word of caution, don't get glue down into the throat, because the sound comes out through here. Don't get through glue down in here. The speaker won't work. Ask me how I know. The one drawback of the iPhone 5 is that it tends to be not nearly as loud as the iPhone 4s. Overall, though, you really can't tell. Okay, moving away from the fruit company, on the Android side, we do have speakers such as like the Samsung Galaxy 4. As you can see, what's unique about the Samsungs is that they actually don't use a bottom discharge or side edge discharge for their sound. They use the broad side. So you can see here the grills that's where the sound discharge is coming out. Do have to make a little bit of modification, this little flimsy plastic area where you just cut it out to allow wires to pass through so you can solder onto these two tabs. What's nice about this one too is that the width of this particular speaker happens to be just the width, the right size for most hood locomotives, so you can literally just press it in place and not have to worry about gluing or taping or any other forms of securing it. Okay, all those devices I've shown, I've kind of, they're kind of old. All right, they've fallen by the wayside. There's no longer relevant anymore. So there's new generations. So you have the iPhone 6 and iPhone 7s, and now 8s and 10s. On the Android side, you have the Galaxy 6s, and for those who are using the Galaxy 7s, they come with a realistic flame effect. What's new and upcoming is smartwatches, right? Everything I've shown so far is usually small in one dimension, but as technology progresses, small devices like our smartwatches, they also have speakerphone capabilities, and they too have the same requirements. You want to cover as much as the audio spectrum. You need to be nice, small, and compact, and you want to have the best sound coming out of it. So as a result of that, this is potentially a new frontier where we can open up into using these cell phones into installations in even tighter quarters or even possibly N scale. Okay, I've talked about the technical benefits of using the cell phone speakers, right? But let's talk a little bit of financials for a second. Cell phone speakers are actually a very cost-efficient solution. This is an example of the TCS Sugar Cube that they have. And it's a decent speaker. Again, you can see it has a roll-off at 300 hertz on the bottom end and only 10,000 hertz on the upper end. It's an 8 ohm, 0.85 watts. That's about an average rating. That retails $13.95, and they no longer include the 3D printed enclosure. You now have to manufacture your own. I think you can get the part number that has it, but for the most part, when you generically order the speakers, it's just the speaker and no enclosure is included. Versus the iPhone loudspeaker, 8 ohm. It's an 8 ohm speaker. It's 1 watt. The enclosure is integral, so it's all one piece, plug and play. But I sell it for $2 a speaker versus $13.95 MSRP for the TCS speaker. So as you can see, for a speaker that is better performance, of wider development range, it's also a very cost-efficient solution. So where can I buy? Well, you could go on eBay. You could go search and find it. But I want to draw your attention to this little statement down here. Greater than 7 business days. Realistically, it's probably about a month since it's coming from China. And now with our current situation, it's probably even longer. If you happen to be in Connecticut, you can always stop in at Tom's Trains, our hobby store here in Connecticut. Wethersfield, Connecticut. It's about 15 minutes south of Hartford. We're open from Wednesday to Saturday, 11 to 6 p.m. Obviously, unfortunately, due to our current situation, we're not open, but we can always make individual appointments. Or you can always send an email to both me or Lou. We always have stock available, and we can get it out to you right away. Okay, so let's go into some tips and tricks. Tips and tricks. I swear, you guys, I'm not drunk. Alrighty. So, fancy speaker must require fancy tools, right? Well, let's find out. We need strippers. We need tweezers. We need a soldering iron. Okay, so far so good. Nothing unusual. We need flux. Okay, maybe a little bit exotic for some folks. We need some heat conductive tape, capped on tape. Or you could use electrical tape, but generally not recommended, simply because electrical tape is heat insulating, so it traps the heat into the decoder, versus the Kapton is heat radiative, so it allows heat to dissipate. You do need electronic solder. Please don't use plumber solder. No good things will come out of it. Don't ask me how I know. You need Walther's glue just to have on hand, and then probably heat shrink. So really nothing too out of the ordinary. These are most for those people who do routine decoder installation. This is pretty much normal stuff you would probably already have on your workbench. So, tip number 1, plan out where everything will go. Take the time to fit the capacitors, the speakers, and all the hardware before you start any cutting, snipping, stripping, soldering. There's nothing more frustrating than finding out you snipped a piece of wire too damn short, and now you have to make multiple daisy chains just to get back to length. Do ask me how I know. Tin everything. Flex is your best friend in this application. You only need to go a little bit, and you don't have to go too crazy. So a little dab will do you. But here's a little tip and trick that I learned from working in aerospace. Clean off the excess flux that's left behind with some alcohol. Flux is an acid. The way it works is that when you heat it up, the acid becomes active and it starts to eat away any layer of oxidation on the piece you're about to work with, and that allows solder to bond and adhere to it. But over time, as you can see in this picture, it will corrode if you don't clean it off, and it'll eat away at your connection, which nobody wants. Granted, it does take a while, but it's one of those things where a 30-second job will give you a lifetime of success. It's well worth it. Another little trick that I learned is dealing with insulation on the wire. Strip only a teeny tiny bit at the tip with the wire strippers. So you kind of can see in this photo, there's a number 11 blade, just for reference. That's how much I stripped off. Literally just a teeny tiny tip. When I use the heat from the soldering iron to tin the wire, it will naturally melt the insulation back, leaving you with the perfect length almost every single time. So when it's all said and done, you have this nice, beautiful solder with no wires or exposed wires from insulation melting as it peels back. Tinning of it, of course, helps, but just because you have such a short length, you have more room to work with. Okay, let's take a look at some examples. In this particular one, this is an Atlas Trainman RS32. Now you kind of can see there's the iPhone 4 speakers, there's the decoder. In this particular locomotive, this is a chopped nose edition. As you can see with the weights, there's just no room whatsoever in this locomotive. Sure, you could probably use a tiny sugar cube in this little well, but in reality, this height isn't really all that much. So most of the time, what you end up doing is unscrewing these two screws and pulling off this weight, and then using this space that was formerly occupied by weight. That's where you drop the speaker. But with the iPhone 4 speakers, I was able, because of the thin profiles, literally just plop it on top of the decoder, strap it down with some Kapton tape, and off you go you're off to the races. Best part is, because the sound is coming right out where the prime mover would naturally sit, it sounds like the prime mover is actually producing power and driving the locomotive. Okay. In this Proto 2000s, they are notorious for having a ton of weight in their locomotives. Great for pulling, pain in the butt for installation of decoders. But in this particular case, the SD60 has this little well for where the dynamic brake fan normally sits. Well, using the thin nature and the stout nature, I was able to put it in as well as an added bonus. Because it's located right at the grill, the sound is coming right out and right into the ambient atmosphere, so it doesn't sound so muffled. Okay, for this particular one, the Atlas Classic RS11. In this particular case, there was no space in either the aft long hood or in the right over the motors, because the way the decoder sat pretty high up. So, but there was plenty of space in this high short hood, but I didn't have the length. So in this particular case, I used the iPhone 4, but I cut it down and then sealed off the back end with a piece of styrene. and then just had the speaker point out into the cab. You can't see it on this side, but on the opposite side, the window was cut open for this particular model, so the sound was able to naturally radiate out. Plus, it was also able to radiate out of the truck. Does it sound weird because of the location? A little bit, but really, don't you wouldn't be able to notice it for the most part. Okay, so everything I've described has been fairly large locomotives. Here's an example where I'm using it in the 44 tonner, a tiny, 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 tiny little locomotive. Um, in this particular application, right? Again, really want to take the time to plan things out. Um, and you can see how what's the benefit of that. Everything is nice, compact, and everything's all tucked in neatly. The thing about 44 tonners, quick side note, you have to use the single motor version. The dual motor version, unfortunately, has a tendency to catch on fire, and that's never a good thing. So yeah, you have to use the single motor. And the other benefit of the single motor too is that it sits lower in the chassis, so you have more room to work with versus the dual motor. It pretty much rides up all the way to the hood of the shell. For our demo tonight, we have a fleet of 44 tonners that of various speakers, and we will demonstrate that using those locomotives. Everything I've talked so far has been DCC locomotives. However, with the advent of microelectronics and miniature electronics, we can and microprocessors, we actually could do many other projects other than um, locomotives. So in this particular example, this is an O scale, an old school globe model of a steam calliope used in typically found around circuses. Well, when I was asked to have this built by a fellow club member, I decided, you know what, it would sound pretty cool if we could actually make it play music and whatnot. So I went online and actually found this tiny little MP3 player, and it's all it is it's an MP3 player, and it's running it off of a micro SD card. And then there's the prongs where I connect the battery. But because it's all open, I was able to use the slim nature of the iPhone 4 speakers to pop it in, and then with the shell over the chassis, it hides it really well. I mean, you can kind of see it right there. There's a little bit peeking through, but for the most part, it's well hidden. And the battery just tucks underneath, and I disguise it as if it's like an undercarriage storage compartment. You almost couldn't tell that this thing was actually just a plastic model, and it comes to life. And the kids love it when they come to see us at the Springfield Train Show, and they can hear the steam calliope start to play music. Next up, how to make this thing animated so the pipes look like they're playing music. Okay, so in summary, cell phone speakers are a great alternative for model railroad sound, and it doesn't always have to be DCC locomotives. It could be any sound applications, like, for example, that steam calliope. Another great example is that a model railroad club up in northern Massachusetts started to putting these tiny speakers, these iPhone speakers, into like the roofs of the rolling mill, because they have a steel mill scene. So when you're standing in that particular area of the layout, the cacophony of a steel mill, it really does add to the ambience, and it feels like you're actually standing in the midst of the plant. Yes, so cell phone speakers are small and compact. You can get into very many interesting installation and applications. It does cover the whole human auditory range, so it gives you nice, clear, high fidelity sound. There's no need to engineer an enclosure. Very economical when you compare it to other speakers manufactured specifically for the hobby. So if anyone is interested, like I said, please send us an email. Those are our email addresses. We can purchase speakers, or if you have any other questions too, you can always email that to us after this presentation. And most importantly, I want to wish everyone happy rails and happy modeling. So with that, we're going to start setup for the live demo. I'll start taking any questions in the time being.
Alrighty, Kaylee, we have on the first one is there an issue with the impedance mismatch and power output between the DCC decoder and the speaker?
Only when you have 100 ohm speakers. So the ESU, the old ESU decoders, the 3.5 series or the version 3 series, they all required 100 ohms. So in this particular application, because these cell phone speakers are all 8 ohms, it won't work. But other than that, any modern decoders that uses 4 or 8 ohms or even 32 ohms, the 8 ohms is fine.
Have you ever tried using a notebook speaker?
We've tried one. I don't remember the output of it. Typically, notebook speakers tend to be a little bit larger than cell phone speakers, so that's generally the main reason why we haven't used it too frequently. In O scale, they work great, or even S scale, they work great. But as far as HO and even N scale, they're just a little bit on the larger side.
All right. What are the options for N scale?
Right now, N scale is a tough market. The iPhone 4s could fit into some of the CAL units, so like the E units, F units. But as far as N scale GE or hood units, it's a tough challenge. I'm hoping that in the near future, as like I said, the smartwatch technology becomes more readily available and repair parts become more abundant, that that would open up a new market and allow for hood engine installation.
All right. Let's see. What if the decoder puts out 2 watts, but the speaker is rated for 1 watt?
Yeah, don't. Yes, don't turn it up. So what we found is that a lot of times the newer generation of decoders that are advertised for 2 watts are actually putting out more than 2 watts. So right now, there's 2 solutions. One, you can wire multiple speakers in series, so you have 16 watts, or I mean 16 ohms, which will help absorb some of that energy. The other alternative is if you can't fit into 2 speakers, it's just simply turn it at max power, maybe at like 60%. That'll help.
All right. So, Kaylee, Lionel
Jordan.
Strang has asked, could you repeat the part just after you have said, "Hi, I'm Kaylee"?
Okay, let's go back to the top. Lionel, I'll give you a private showing.
How much power does it use for dead rail applications?
The speaker itself doesn't take power. It's really dependent upon the decoder. So I actually did an installation for Jim Lincoln, and he's, as those who may know, he's doing Proto 48, so O scale, and he's using pretty much dead rail technology. I installed the battery pack, and using the Lux Sound large decoder, I think he said he was able to get 2 days of moderate usage, or basically enough to run 1 op session. So the speaker itself doesn't necessarily draw power. It's really the decoder that's drawing the power.
So, Tom Gazer asked, can you just attach an iPhone speaker to the top of the decoder?
In terms of placement?
Yes, I believe that is what he is referring to.
Okay, yeah. There's no problem. I generally try to avoid pointing the magnet portion of the speaker over the processor, just to kind of give some separation. But for the most part, I've done that many times in many installation and never had an issue with it.
All right. Um, so you said you have a demonstration for us?
Yep. Okay. So I am going to first show you. I forgot to show this earlier.
All right.
Oh. Okay. So here we have a minor technical difficulty, folks. Bear with me 1 second. Let me get our camera set back up.
When using two cell phone speakers, do you wire in series or in parallel?
You could do either. The important thing to make sure that you don't wire it so that it exceeds the limitations of the decoder. Meaning, if your decoder is only rated for 8 ohms, don't wire it in series in parallel, because it halves it and makes it only 4 ohms.
How much do each speakers weigh?
Next, nothing.
Okay. I've also heard speakers with a passive radiator give better bass sound in smaller speakers, and I see AESU sells them. How do cell phone speakers compare?
That's a good question. I haven't had too much experience with using the capacitive type speakers. So it's possible that they may be better. I don't know. That's a good question.
All right. So what is the sound curve for a steam locomotive?
Steam locomotives are interesting. Diesels kind of have a very distinct peak, because it's pretty much only a single source of sound, the prime mover. You get some ancillary sounds, but for the most part, it's all predominantly peaked at one location. Steam locomotives tend to be kind of all over the place, so they tend to have more an even sound profile. Naturally, I think with the chuffs, you're going to get more of the bass end, but you have the hiss of the steam cock, so you get some of the high ends as well. So it's an interesting blend, steam locomotives. I wasn't able to find a commercially available curve, so that's why I don't have a graph for steam locomotives. But if I were to imagine it, I think it would be kind of almost all over the frequency spectrum.
Will you eventually have a steam installation clinic?
Um, yeah, I've done a couple, so yes, possibly. This is the future goal, is to kind of revise it with new installations as I come across. But yeah, I will definitely try to include Steam in the future. Okay. Any more questions?
Um, Not that I see, so we can go on to your demonstration. We have about 15 minutes left.
Perfect. Okay. So what you kind of can see here, and I meant to show this earlier, is a cutout board of all the different speakers options that we have. As you can see, the iPhone 4 is kind of the common ubiquitous one, and then there's the iPhone 5s you saw, the different variants of 5. And then also the different cut orientations you can do with it. Like I said, generally I try not to cut more than over half of this overall length. Anything beyond that, I find that you can hear the difference, but for the most part, you really don't hear too much of a difference as long as you stay within half of overall length. You can see the different. This is the iPhone 6s, the 6 Plus, standard 6. There's the 7 Plus, and I thought we had a regular 7, but it appears not. So, this is just the different options that we have in stock. We also, like I said, have a couple of Android versions that we didn't have time to mount on this board. So just like you said, if you're interested in buying any, most of them fall in that the iPhone 4s, I think, are selling $2. Some of the newer generation 10 is 3, simply because it's newer. The repair parts haven't saturated the market, but for the most part, $2 to $3 is typical for these speakers. Okay.
All right.
So we're gonna
And
switch over. Go ahead, Jordan.
we do have one more question while you
Okay.
do your switch over.
Okay.
And it is speakers with one watt, are they enough for decoders with two outputs?
Sorry, could you repeat the question again?
It's speakers with one output with 1 watt, are they enough for decoders with two outputs?
Um, Typically, I have not seen the output a dual output. The only one that has a dual output is BLI decoders. They are the only true stereo um, decoders. Most decoders nowadays are only are single or mono channeled. So I don't think there's an issue. But I think if you were to take a dual output decoder like a BLI and wire it into a single speaker, it may not be able to handle the wattage. I think that's the bigger concern.
Okay. And one of the other questions we have is when and you may be able to show a picture later on, but where would you cut an iPhone 4 speaker? I'm going to assume it depends on what type of locomotive you're going to put it into.
Yeah, it really does depend a little bit on application. Typically, I literally just take the length of it and just chop it down on the back end and keep the rounded side. If we go back to our board for a second. Okay, let me get it in focus here. Okay. Here we go. In this particular example, this is typically how I usually cut it. Is you see this overall shape, or you see the overall shape of the one up here, right? I usually just chop it off at the end and then seal it with a piece of styrene. But occasionally, sometimes you have the length, but you don't necessarily have the width. You could just cut off this little lob on the back end right here, and then seal it with a piece of styrene.
All right. So
Okay.
we do have about 5 minutes left.
Okay. So let's go into the live demo.
All right.
All right. First things first, we're gonna fire up the 44 tonner with a um, a, uh, um, a regular SoundTrax speaker. Now, the key thing about this demo of these demo locomotives is that all of them have been factory installed, and that's it. There's no change in EQ. There's no change in volume. Literally, we wired them up, wired up the decoders, wired up the speakers, and we just plopped it on the track. So this one you're going to hear is a SoundTrax half-inch round speaker. So we're going to ring the bell. Now you're going to hear the horn. Okay, not bad. I mean, you got down in a 44 tonner. That's pretty awesome. So now we're going to demonstrate the full iPhone speakers, iPhone 4. Can you hear the bell? Now the horn. And now going back to the SoundTrax round half-inch round speakers for comparison. Okay, we're going to ring the bell. And then the horn. Okay. Going back to the iPhone 4, we took the shell off. You kind of could see what's going on on the inside. Again, that proper planning really goes a long way in helping out and being able to fit the decoder. The decoder for this particular locomotive is using the old Tsunami ones, the 750 series. And that's how we were able to kind of get it fit. So again, powering it on. can hear quite a difference. Here's the bell, the horn. Now the bell. Okay. Question. What does a cut iPhone 4 speakers? So this particular one, we cut about 2/3. About a third. So we cut off about a third on the back end. Okay. Now the bell. And the horn. So you probably can. I'm not sure how well it's going to come over the audio setup, but as you can imagine, it's not quite as noticeable. Not quite as good, but not nearly as noticeable as one might think. So going back to the full iPhone for a second. Okay, now the cut iPhone. A little bit more on the higher end, but overall not too noticeable. So now we're going to use and demonstrate the TCS Sugar Cube speaker. And overall, not too bad. Very comparable to the full iPhone speakers. But again, looking at the cost versus benefit, as a reminder, the TCS one was almost $14 MSRP versus $2 for the iPhone 4 speakers. All right, so we've loaded on a couple more other examples. This is using the ESU build-up kit Sugar Cube speakers. Again, better than the soundtracks, but not quite as good as the TCS, and certainly not quite as good as the iPhone 4 speakers. So this one is actually using a different cell phone brand. This is a Huawei, which is a Chinese brand of speakers. You may have heard of it from the news due to a bunch of issues with our government and the company. But this is using a Huawei speaker. Pretty decent bass, but you kind of lose out on the clarity.
All right. So it looks like we're unfortunately hitting the wrapping up point, Kaylee.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Kaylee. Thank you for your wonderful clinic on speakers. I have learned a lot personally myself. And up next is Clark Kooning with Model Rating 101. Thank you, guys. We'll be on at 8, and we're going to have a nice time to get a drink and everything else.